All right, with Hashem's help, we will learn today Yevamos Daf Mem Daled. We left off yesterday Yevamos Daf Mem Gimel Amid Beis by the Mishnah. So says the Mishnah, Arba Achim Nesuyim Arba Noshim Vamesu. As the Gemara will point out, we're speaking about a family that has more than 4 brothers. 4 of the brothers married each one a separate wife that were non-related. Vamesu, and the 4 brothers died without children. So says the Mishnah that Im Rotza HaGadol Shebehem Liyabim Es Kulam, that if the eldest surviving brother wants to do the mitzvah of Yibum with all of the 4 batim, with all of these 4 widows, Harashus Biyadai. And the Gemara is going to point out the chiddush of the Mishnah. But first of all, the din of Ahoya HaBachar, as we learned before, doesn't mean that the mitzvah is only on the oldest brother. It's on the eldest surviving brother. And the mitzvah on him is to do Yibum with all of his brother's widows. Next din. Mi Shahaya Nasui Lishtei Nashim. Vameis. When one man was married to more than one wife. So the Mishnah is quoting here the din that we learned many times beforehand, that biyasa echalitzasa shal achas mehen poiteres tzarasa, that the mitzvah of Yibum is to build up your brother's bias, to build up your brother's household and not both of his households. So having Yibum or chalitza with only one is the completion of the mitzvah, and it exempts the other from both Yibum and chalitza. Daf Mem Dalet.
Once are allowed dafka,
Hoysa achas ksheira v'achas psula. If indeed the case was that one man had 2 wives, and Yibum or Chalitza will only be done with one, so if one of those wives were kosher, as we learned before, fit to marry a Kohen, in other words, she didn't come into the marriage with history, but the other wife was already disqualified for marrying a Kohen, because before she married the brother, she was married to another man. And she underwent, let's say she got a get, so she's anyways a gerusha. So im hoya chaylitz, if the surviving brother is choosing to do chalitza, so chaylitz lipsula, let him do chalitza with the one that is anyways disqualified to marry a kohen. As we learned that midrabanan, a chalutza cannot marry a kohen, so do the chalitza with the wife who's anyways a gerusha. However, but if he's going to do Yibum, then he could do Yibum with the Ksheira. Doesn't mean he has to, but here he really has a choice. But by Chalitza, he should do it with the one who's disqualified anyway. So begins the Gemara, Arba Achim Salkadaitach. The Gemara is asking on the wordings of the Mishnah. The Mishnah begins speaking about there were 4 brothers, and they all died. Well, if the family only had 4 brothers, and they all died, then there's no one left to do Yibum or Chalitza. Ela Ema, the Mishnah must be speaking about a case that aside of the 4 brothers that were married and died, there were other brothers. So the wording should be Arba'a Mei Achim, if 4 of the brothers were married and died.
Well, what's the nafkamina for?
We'll see in a second. Harashus Biyadai, so the eldest brother can do Yibum with all of them. So says the Gemara, V'shafkulei. Will they allow him to marry all 4? Vatanya, we learned in a Braisa that when it says in the parsha of Yibum v'karoloi ziknei iroi, that the elders of the city call the surviving brother, so from the words v'karoloi, they call him, we learn that they refers to the Beis Din, and v'loi shluchan. And when they call the surviving brother to tell him to do Yibum or Chalitza, this is a mitzvah that should not be done through an agent of the Beis Din, even though normally the rule is Shliach Shaladam Kamaisei. But here it has to be done by the Dayanim themselves. Then it says V'dibru Elav, that they speak to the surviving brother. Malamed, from the word that they speak to him, is Shemasiyan Loi Eitzah Hoigenes, that they give him good advice. What's pshat? They give him good advice. That they tell him, that if the surviving brother is young and the widow is old, the definition of young and old, it says in Shulchan Aruch, is 10 years apart. Or the opposite, if he was old and the widow, the potential wife, the potential Yevama is Yalda, she's young. So they tell him, Malach Eitzel Yalda, or Malach Eitzel Zakena. What good would be a marriage between an older and a younger person? Kalech Eitzel Sheke Moischa. Go and marry someone that is more like you. When a man marries a woman that's a lot younger than him, being that their needs are very different, so it's almost as if he's inviting misbehavior in this household. Because he will not fulfill her needs, she will not fulfill his needs, and trouble will come from that. So just like we see, and va'al tasim kitata, or the Albach says va'al tachnes kitata b'veisecha, don't bring fights into your house. So just like we see that if the age difference was a lot, was 10 years or more, the Beis Din advised him not to marry such a woman, such a Yevama. If there is a brother that has an option of doing Yibum with 4 wives, that's also bringing trouble into your household, the way the Gemara is going to obviously put it here, because a man normally will not have the means to support 4 wives. So why does the Mishnah say that Harashus B'yadai, they should have tried to discourage him? Now it's clear from this Braisa that the Gemara brings that they don't prohibit Yibum, but they give him an advice. And this contradicts the wordings of our Mishnah, that the Mishnah says, Harashus B'yadai, he has Rishus. Well, if he'll do it, it will be a done deed, but the wordings, L'chayra, doesn't fit. Answers the Gemara, Lo Yitzricha, the reason why the Mishnah uses the word Harashus B'yadai, because we're speaking about a surviving brother, the Efsherle, that he has wealth, that he is able to support 4 wives. And like you asked, why Dafka 4? And Hihachi Afilo Tuvinami, if he is wealthy, let the Mishnah give an example of there were 12 brothers and 11 of them died. So answers the Gemara, no, 4 is Dafka. That 8 Satayva Komash Malon, the Mishnah is telling you the maximum number, that Dalid in, that 4 wives, that's even when you're wealthy and you can afford more, that's acceptable. But Fei Loi, but more than 4, that the Beis Din will tell him not to. Why? Ki Hecha, the Nimtiya, Aina B'chaydish. In order for him to be able to be intimate with every one of the wives 1 time in the month. As Rashi points out, Rashi brings the Gemara in Ksubas that speaks about the mitzvah on the husband to be intimate with his wife, and what is the frequency of the mitzvah. So by a Talmud Chacham it says that he should be with his wife once a week on Friday night. Now, if a man is going to have 4 wives, a Talmud Chacham has a chiyuv to be with his wife at least once a week, which means that each wife would get a relation with her husband once a month. Now, why is once a month acceptable? I mean, if the mitzvah of Aina is for a couple to be together once a week, so then he should only marry 1 wife. Or if he's a poil, like the Gemara says in the Ksubas, that a worker should be with his wife twice a week, so then maybe a poil should marry 2 wives. But what's the 4 wives? So many of the Rishonim point out that the mitzvah to be with one's wife is the mitzvah on him. And he fulfills his mitzvah if he's married to 4 wives, that each one would be with him at least once a month, which is when they go to the mikveh, approximately. And there's a mitzvah for a couple to be together on the night when a woman goes to a mikveh. Many other Rishonim say that the mitzvah is for the woman also to be with her husband once a week. But Bamed Varam Amunim, that is when the couple chooses to marry each other. But in the case of Yibum, well, no, it's just ideal. It's not a chiyuv, but it's the ideal for a Talmud Chacham. But when a case, even if it's for her also, but when is it a mitzvah for both of them, on both of them, so to say? That is if they both chose to get married. But in the case of Yibum, being that it's, so to say, Hashem was a shatchen for this marriage, in such a case, for her, once a month would be the minimum accepted norm. We find this also by Yaakov Avinu, that after he was running away from Lavan, and Lavan caught up to him, I think it's in Parshas Vayetze. So Lavan told at the end, after they made this covenant, they built the Gal Eid, and Lavan tells Yaakov that im tikach, right, im ta'anos benoisai, vim tikchu nashim al benoisai. So Rashi says, im ta'anos benoisai means that don't afflict them by withholding intimacy from them, and he had 4 wives. Yaakov was a Talmud Chacham. So from there you see that if it's less than once a month, that's already an affliction.
Why did Lavan have to say to him?
Not to marry more.
No, but wasn't it for Yaakov Avinu? Didn't he know that? Why? What's the...
Well, I think that Lavan didn't suspect Yaakov not knowing the din, but Lavan, who was a wicked person, suspected that all people around him have that wickedness, have that evilness.
Speaking of himself.
He was ma'ana people, he afflicted people. So he wanted to make sure that Yaakov will not be like him. But Yaakov married 4 wives. For his children he cared. Okay, weiter. Mi shahayun nasui. Mishnah told us that if a man was married to 2 wives and he died childless, the mitzvah of yibum or chalitza is only on one of the 2. So the Gemara says, why? V'neyabim litarvayu. Why isn't there a mitzvah of yibum on both of the widows? Amar Rab Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Amar Kra. Again, in Devarim, in the parsha of yibum, it says, Asher lo yivne es beis achiv. So from here we see beis echad hu bainam ve'ein baina shnei batim, that his obligation is only to rebuild one of his brother's houses. Frag the Gemara, Mela, when it comes to building yibum, the pasuk says build one house in a negative form, but the building is one house. But if the brother, the living brother, is choosing chalitza, perhaps v'nachaloitz litarvayu, maybe chalitza should have to be done with both. Amar Marzutra bar Tuvria, Amar Kra, Beis Chalutz Hanoal. By Chalitza, the Torah also uses a singular expression that by Yisachadu Chaylitz, ve'ein Chaylitz Shnei Batim. It's only one and not on 2. Frag the Gemara, according to the Bach's Girsa, v'nachaloitz l'chada, v'niyabim l'chada. Okay, so if the pasuk says yibum 1, chalitza 1, maybe if a man leaves 2 wives, you should be obligated to do yibum to 1 and still chalitza to the other. So Amar Kra answers the Gemara. It says im lo yachpoitz, that if the man doesn't want to do yibum, he does chalitza. We had this connection before. Ha-chafetz yabim, teaching us that chalitza and yibum go on the same track, which is kol ha'oila liyibum oila lachalitza. If a woman is eligible for yibum, then she's eligible for chalitza. Kol she'ein oila liyibum, a woman who's not eligible for yibum is not eligible for chalitza, meaning there's no chalitza needed. And being that it says by yisechad, both by yibum and by chalitza, so what are you telling me? Do yibum with one and chalitza with the other? Once you did yibum with one, you can't do yibum with the other. If you can't do yibum with the other, then there's no need to do chalitza with that one as well.
Why does the Gemara here take, and the Mishnah also, that there's only Esha and Tzara and not 4 of them, like we did in the Resha?
Because if you don't have to do it to 2, you for sure don't have to do it to more. 1 second, the Reish is speaking about 1 man married to 1 wife. This case is one man himself is married to more than 1 wife.
Right, and I'm saying why only 2?
Because the din is by 2, for sure by 3. If you can't do it by 2, for sure not 3. Says the Tosfos, Kol She'ein Oilam, the third Tosfos here on the Amid. So he asks a great question. V'im Taimar, Harei Cheresh v'Chareshes, a deaf, mute man and woman who we know that are unable to do the mitzvah of chalitza. The Gemara is going to speak about that later. The einam oilam l'chalitza, because they can't speak. And part of the chalitza ceremony isn't only the taking off of the shoe and the spitting on the ground, it's also a conversation that the man verbatim reads psukim in the Torah, and then the chalutza reads back psukim in the Torah. So if they can't speak, then you can't do the chalitza ceremony. And nevertheless, v'oilam l'yibum, they still do yibum. And if the Gemara is saying here, this is not the first time that they go on the same track, only kol ha'oila l'yibum is oila l'chalitza. So the same thing should be vice versa. Why is it that a cheresh and a chereshes, a deaf mute man and woman who cannot do chalitza, why do they have the mitzvah of yibum? Answers Tosfos, the yeshleimer dahasam b'nei chalitza ninu. Deaf mute people are people who essentially could do chalitza. Ella de pumayuhu de ka'evluhu. It's as if their mouths are hurting them. So it's an external technical reason why they can't do it. But they are essentially mechuyev. This Tosfos is a very important Tosfos. It's used by many poskim. We have a din by Safrus that a person who is not mechuyev, let's say, to wear tefillin, cannot write a pair of tefillin. A person who is not mechuyev to learn Torah should not write a sefer Torah. So, for example, a woman cannot write a pair of tefillin. Question is, they ask, if there's a person that, God forbidding, is missing a left arm, who's spotted from the hand tefillin, they could write a pair of tefillin. Why? So they give the same answer, that essentially he's a mechuyev in tefillin. Just he doesn't have a hand, so he can't do it technically. But since he's essentially mechuyev, then he can write it. Just like over here, whenever there is an essential chiyuv, then even though they cannot do it technically, it doesn't prevent them from doing what they could do. Okay, back in the Gemara. Now the Gemara says, V'oid, and furthermore, going back, why don't we do yibum with one and chalitza with the other? Shelo yoimru. Many people don't have these lines in the Gemara now. Shelo yoimru, people, the observer shouldn't say that bayis miktsasei banoy miktsasei chalutz. That a house has to be partially built and partially not, and partially it has to undergo chalitza. Let people say that. I mean, if that would be the din, that with one wife you do yibum and with the other chalitza, what do you care what people will say regarding that? So the Gemara says, now, if the order would be yibum and then chalitza, then let people say what they want. Ella, there's a fear, that if chalitza will be done first, then what did we learn together? That the moment chalitza is done, kula alma, everyone, both Rabbi Yechanan and Reish Lakish, right? I think we had this in Daf Yud, or in the beginning, so I think Daf Yud or Yud Aleph, they both hold that the one who did chalitza, he cannot marry that chalutza, and that is prohibited under the lav of kiven shalibana shalayivna. No, but the sugya began, I think, in Daf Yud. That's where we have the discussion. Now, what about the other brothers with the chalutza? Or what about the man who did chalitza with the tzara? So here we had a Rabbi Yechanan who was lenient, who held that if he would marry the tzara, he would not be violating the erev of Eishesach. The erev of Eishesach fell to the sides the moment there was a mitzvah of yibum. For all of them, for both her and the co-wife, you have the lav of kivin shalibana shuvla yivna. And obviously the Gemara here is quoting the words of Rabbi Yechanan, and according to Reish Lakish, it's even a worse prohibition. But regardless, Rabbi Yechanan or Reish Lakish, the point of the Gemara is well taken. That if a man would do yibum, chalitza first and then yibum, once a person does chalitza, minimally, he would be usher to marry yibum, the co-wife, under the lav, and we don't want people to do that. So therefore, even the Chachamim did not add that obligation. You do yibum or chalitza only with one wife, and that's it. Take the Gemara, ve'ema ki ika chadatas yabim. So the Gemara asks, if the Torah is implying the mitzvahs only with one, maybe what the Torah is teaching us is that the whole mitzvah of yibum is only when a man had one wife. But perhaps if a man has two wives, then there's no need for yibum or chalitza with either of them. Answers the Gemara, Imkain, if that were to be the case, Tzaras Erva da Asa Rachmana Lamali. In the beginning of Masechta Yevamos and Daf Gimel Amud Beis, the beginning of that whole sugya of Esa Doisel Doichaloisasa, it all began on a braisa that was giving you the pasuk, right? V'ishal ha'chayis l'sikach litzroir, legalas servasa, Allah b'chayah. And there we learned that there is an exemption, not only if one of the wives is an erva, but the exemption of erva also goes on her co-wife. Now, if whenever there are two wives, l'chatchila, there's never a mitzvah of yibam and chalitza, then that extra wording in the pasuk to exempt the co-wife of an erva is not necessarily. Because if there is a co-wife, if you're saying that whenever there's two wives, there's to begin with no mitzvah of yibum, then b'chlal there's no mitzvah of yibum or chalitz. Hashta beis ba'alma marta lav b'nei chalitza v'yibum ninu. If you're going to say that there's no mitzvah whenever there's more than one wife, so then saras erva mibaya, did the Torah have to write an extra word to exempt a saras erva? So that's a raya that even when there are two wives, there is a mitzvah of yibum and chalitza with one of them. And the chiddush there of the pasuk is that if one of the wives is an erva, then there isn't any more the mitzvah, neither on the co-wife. So the Gemara counters, that's not a proof. Alamaloi, why not? Itzrach, you do need a pasuk. That means even if you were to say that whenever there's two wives, there's no mitzvah, but whenever one of the two wives is an erva, there you would have thought that there is a mitzvah with the co-wife of Yibum or Chalitza. Because you would have thought that erva abroi kaima. Since one of the wives is an erva, so she is totally excluded from the mitzvah of Yibum and Chalitza, so we should consider it as if he only has one wife. And therefore, if it's considered as if he only has one wife, so then v'tisyabim tzarasa, and therefore the Torah has to tell you komashmul on the asira. So back to the question, maybe whenever there is more than one wife, there's no mitzvah to begin with. So the Gemara answers, no. That in the Parsha of Yibum it says the words Yevimtoi, Yevimtoi, twice, and one of the two times was not necessarily. So Riba, that comes to include, even when a man has two wives, there is the mitzvah of Yibum. But with whom? With one. There's a mitzvah of Chalitza, with whom? Only with one. Yibum and Chalitza with only one of the wives. And the Mishnah concluded that if the man is going to choose to do chalitza, then he should do chalitza with the woman who was anyways unfit to marry a kohen, a woman who was already divorced from a prior marriage. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Kan Shana Rebbe. It was from this Mishnah that Rebbe taught that Yishbaich Adam Meibayrei, that a person who has water in his pit, and it's water that he does not need, a person should not spill it out when va'achedim tzrichem lahem, when other people need that water. In other words, Bal Tashchis is a very broad,
including for others.
Yeah, it's a very broad mitzvah, and that also includes such a case. Even though you can argue, there are many other people aside of Kahanim, but if you're doing chalitza, you're not going to be with her. Why are you disqualifying a woman who otherwise would have been kosher? You might as well do it to a woman who anyways is not kosher to marry a kohen. Don't take away something from someone else when there's no difference for you either way. Mishnah. The Mishnah begins telling us the din that we learned many times before regarding the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Whenever there is a union that happened, if that union is forbidden with a lav, is the product of that union a mamzer or not? So says the Mishnah, Hamachzir girushasai. A man who divorces his wife, who then gets married to another man, actually, even if she only gets engaged to another man, and then that other man divorces her or dies, so there's a law in the Torah that the original husband is not allowed to marry his original wife. And it's a law. There is no penalty of kares. There's certainly no capital punishment. The Torah says, Loi sikach, the Torah says the words that Loi suchal bailo harishon lekachta. Don't remarry her. If a man did remarry her, violating a law, or if a person who did chalitza with his brother's widow then marries the widow, as we just learned, according to everyone, she herself will be prohibited under a law and not under any sarkaris, because Eishesach for her fell away the moment she fell into Yibum. So that two scenarios where there's a law, and now the Mishnah says that a scenario that apparently is not a lav. Until now we learned that there's a isur midarabanan for a man to marry any close relative of his chalutza. Just like mida'iraisa, a man cannot marry a relative of his wife, even after he divorces her. It's called kreivas girushasai, is asur mida'iraisa, many times with the penalty of kares. A man divorces his wife, a man is married, so marrying her sister, achos ishtoi, is a erva where there's kares. And even if a man divorces his wife, if she's living, a man cannot marry her sister, isur kares. And midrabanan, kurevas chalutzasei. So l'chayra, this is a isur midrabanan, which will be a problematic. So the Gemara, the Mishnah says, yoitzi, number one, they cannot be together. And as the Gemara will point out, according to Rabbi Akiva, you don't even need a get. Even though there's only an Isur Lav, forget about the third case for a second. And if, God forbid, that union produced a child, v'havlad mamzer, divrei Rabbi Akiva. So we have the opinion of Rabbi Akiva that Isur Lav produces a mamzer. The Chachamim disagree and they say, Ein havlad mamzer. That true, they should not have been together. But if it was a Lav without Kares, then the children are not mamzerim. Umoidim, but Chachamim agree with Rabbi Akiva that benoise karevas girushasai, that if a man is going to marry his divorced wife's relative, let's say sister or mother, that's an isur kadis, shehavlad mamzer. Everyone holds, not everyone, we're going to learn later that there's a Rabbi Yeshua that holds that when is the product of a forbidden union a mamzer or a mamzeres, only if that's a union that carries a capital punishment. That's the most lenient opinion. That shitas Rabbi Yeshua. The opinion of the Chachamim is, even if there's no capital punishment, but there's kadis, there too, the vlad is a mamzer. And the most chomer is Rabbi Akiva, that even by a Isur Lav, if the union produced a child, that child is a mamzer. So now the Gemara's question will be regarding this third case in the Reisha, this Hanoise Karevas Chalutzasei. So frek the Gemara, V'sava Rabbi Akiva, Hanoise Karevas Chalutzasei Havlad mamzer, it's only ever been a kisur. I v'ha'amer Ashlakish, on the Mishnah before, when the Mishnah told you regarding the need of doing Yibum, the need of doing chalitza, if kroivas chalutzos falls to yibum or chalitza, that chalitza has to be done. Yevamos. So kan shana Rebbe. So Rebbe said, achais gerusha, for which nor yibum nor chalitza is needed, is midivrei Torah, and the isur of achais chalutza is only midivrei seifrim, which is why chayletzes v'lo misyabemos. So answers the Gemara, Tenei Kroivas Gerushasai. The third case of the Mishnah is not the Kroiva of your Chalutza, it's the relative of your Gerusha. A relative of a Gerusha is a prohibition that carries an Isur Kadis. And Achanam Mistabro says the Gemara, even though it's not the words of the Mishnah, but it makes sense from the Mishnah itself, because it says in the Sefer regarding the opinion of the sages, Umaidim b'noise krevas girushasei shavlad mamzer. They are moide. Normally they admit is that the Tanakama spoke about a few cases. They argue with some, and they agree with others, but they are agreeing to a case that the Tanakama was talking about. And that would make sense. If Rabbi Akiva was also speaking about Krevas Girushasai, Hainu Diktani Moidim. That's the meaning of the Chachamim that we agree in the third case that you mentioned. If the Rabbi Akiva wasn't even speaking about such a case, then why did the Chachamim use the words that they agree on Moidim? So the Gemara says, well, that's not a proof, because perhaps that perhaps what the Chachamim are saying, Rabbi Akiva was the most chomer by saying that even a chayvil lavin produces a mamzer. The Chachamim don't go as far as Rabbi Akiva, but on the other hand, they are more stringent than Rabbi Yehoshua. In other words, the reason why they said Umaydim is that according to Rabbi Yehoshua, if a man had a relation with Krevas Girushasai, Isur Kares, even there's no mamzerus. The Chachamim are at least more chamur than Rabbi Yehoshua and Umaydim to Rabbi Akiva that have lad mamzer from Chayave Krisus.
So what's Rabbi Yeshua's?
Even only Chayave mamzer is only from a union that was usher with a capital punishment.
Which is example?
A man with his daughter, a man with a married woman. There's also a capital punishment. Wherever it's an erva that also will be punished by death in a human court. Haktan on, says the Gemara. We learn later. That according to Rabbi Akiva, mamzerus is produced from any love with a relative that Hashem said not to be together. Rab Shimon or Shimon Hatimni says kol shechayovin olav kares b'dei shemayim, which is the opinion of the Chachamim. And v'halacha kidvarav. And the Chachamim are telling you the halacha is like Shimon HaTimni and not like Rabbi Yeshua. V'dilma kasasan, okay, period. So there's no proof from the Mishnah, but nevertheless, the Gemara is saying that the Tanakama Rabbi Akiva was not speaking about Krevas Chalutzasai, he was speaking about Krevas Girushasai. Now the Gemara says, v'dilma kasasan lantana ki Rabbi Shimon HaTimni. If the Tana is trying to teach us a Stam Mishnah that the halacha is like Shimon HaTimni, imkein litanei sha'ar chayove krisus krevas girushasai lameli. Still, I have a proof. Even if the Chachamim are using the words umaydim to tell you, not like Rabbi Yeshua, but why did they give the example of a man marrying the relative of his divorced wife, he could have given any other example. If he's just trying to tell you that for chayav krisus, you create a mamzer. Why dafka this example? Elo shmamino, aidaba. L'chayra, that proves because Rabbi Akiva was speaking about that case. So Vaita the Gemara says that's not a proof. Because Dilma la'olam le'aidaba. Maybe Rabbi Akiva holds that kroivas chalutzosai is asr midoiraisa. By a lav. Which is why Rabbi Akiva holds that avlad mamzer even from kroivas chalutzosai. The Chachamim are not addressing kroivas chalutzosai. They just want to say that from Chayave Krisus the Vlad is a mamzer, not from Chayave Lavim. Why did they give this as an example? Because va'ayda the Tani Machze Girushosai, V'noise Chalutzosai, V'kroives Chalutzosai, being that Rabbi Akiva gave 3 examples, so the Chachamim give an example that's similar to his examples, not exactly the same. So Tani Nami Kroivas Girushosai. And back, and maybe Rabbi Akiva in the Reisha actually spoke about Kroivas Chalutzasai. So the Gemara says, Ela Kroivas Chalutzasai Rabbi Akiva have a mamzer. And maybe, according to Rabbi Akiva, a person marrying the relative of his Chalutza is prohibited by an Isur Lav, and therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, the kids will be a mamzer. And Amar Rabbi Chiya Bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hainu Tamid Rabbi Akiva. And what would be the pasuk? According to him, that it's not a Isur Midrabanan, because it says, Beis Chalutz HaNoal, HaKosev Kra'oi Beisoi. The fact that even after Chalitza is done, the Torah says that she is called Beis Chalutz HaNoal Bayis. Bayis means she's considered his ex-family, just like by one's wife. Even if one divorces one's wife, you cannot marry her relatives Mido Eiraisa, according to Rabbi Akiva. Perhaps there's an Isur Deoraisa, Dafka his case, the Chachamim were moedim on a similar case with this Chayv Kares. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Shimon Bar Rebbe. Hakoil moedim. Hakoil means both the Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva agree, B'machzir, Girushasai, that if a man is going to marry a woman who he divorced, turning the page, even if the child is not considered a mamzer, because there's no cutters there, nevertheless, shahavlat pogam l'kohuna, that the child will have a pagam because it was born from a Isur Lav. Says Rashi, what does pagam mean? We had the sugya before. It's a good chazara now. No. Any lav. When a person married girushasai, that means that union is prohibited without cutters. Says Rashi, v'im yolda bas, if he produces a daughter, that daughter cannot marry a kohen. Like a halala, even though that's a Yisraelis. Okay. In other words, it's not that the Chachamim hold completely the opposite of Rabbi Akiva, that the child is 100% kosher. It's not a mamzer, but it's called a pogum. Says the Gemara, hakoil man hakoil moedim. Who is the everyone? So the Gemara says Shimon Atimni. The Afagav, the Amar Shimon Atimni, like we just learned, that ain't mamzer mechayav ilavim. So we say nihi the mamzer lei have pogum miya have. That's the din that we were taught in the name of Rab Shimon Bar Rebbe. The question is, where do we know this from? We learned this whole sugya on Daf Yudalef Amud Beis and Daf Tezvav Amud Beis. This whole daf, this Amar is a chazar. So the Gemara says we know that from a Kal V'Chomer Me'almana. It's going to be one of these great Gemaras. We're going to have a Kal V'Chomer. The Gemara is going to try to refute the Kal V'Chomer with 3 questions, and the Gemara is going to resolve all 3 of them. That will be the conclusion of here. Havladas Pagam. So what's the Kal V'Chomer from an almana? Uma almana l'kayin gadol. The isur, the unique isur, that a widow cannot marry a kayin gadol. She'ein isura shava b'koil. An almana can even marry a kayin. A widow can only not marry a kayin gadol. So it's a very specific isur. Nevertheless, b'na pagum, if an almana marries a kayin gadol, her child cannot marry a kohen. The child has a din of a pogum, even though they didn't violate an isur kares. That's only a lav, that an almana should not marry a kohen gadol. So zu, this isur of machzir girushasei, which is also a lav, but it's a lav on everyone. She isura shava bakoil, which somehow makes it worse. No one can marry their wives after they divorced them, if they married another man, is Einoi Din, Shebina Pagum. That's the Kal V'Chomer. Okay, so the Gemara says, one second, Ikele Mifrach, I have number 1. I can refute this Kal V'chomer. Ma'ala almana. You know why by an almana l'kain gadol, which only violated a lav. Nevertheless, her child is considered a pogum. If they have a daughter, the daughter cannot marry a kain. Shekain hi atzma mischalelas. Because if this almana will do tshuva, and she'll get a divorce from her husband, the kain gadol. I'll take that back. If this almana becomes a widow from the kain gadol, so she's a double widow now. The din is she cannot marry a kain hadid. She didn't do tshuva, but if she's no longer in the marriage with the kohen gadol, she's not a gerusha. Since she was together with a kohen gadol in violation, she herself becomes disqualified from ever being with a kohen, even though she otherwise would not have been disqualified. So maybe that's why, since she becomes mischaleles, her product becomes mechulul on a kohen. But when it comes to a machzer gerushasai, the wife who was divorced, who married another man, who was widowed or divorced, cannot marry the first husband, she anyways was never qualified to marry a kohen anymore because she's a gerusha. So her violation did not add anything vis-a-vis her isser to a kohen. The act, the prohibited act, was not mechalal her. So maybe her child will not be a paguma. That's number one. We're going to have a comeback to that. Question number two. We learned clearly before, how can you tell me that if a person was machzir girushasei, the product of that child will also be asura l'kayin? When we learn, the pasuk says that lo yuchal bai lo harishan asher shilcha lashuv l'kachtei liyis le'isha achri asher hu tama'a ki to'eva hi. So we learned before, to'eva hi teaches us, the Braisa says, that it's an abominable act for her to marry her original husband. But why did the Torah say the word he? To tell you that only she did something that's considered despicable. But her children are not considered despicable, meaning they can marry kahana. That's the meaning of the Braisa. So there's words in the Torah that tell you against the din of the Samaira and din of the Tana. Tanya, we learned hamachzir girushasei, v'hanoise chalutzasei, v'hanoise koreves chalutzasei. Our Mishnah Rabbi Akiva says that this is a brayso, more elaborate, ein loy ba kedushin. According to Rabbi Akiva, kedushin is not teifes even when there's only a chi of lav connected to mamzerus. So there's no kedushin, which means that ve'ein tzricha get heimenu. So when the Mishnah says yoitzi without a get, and vihi psula, and velada psula, she becomes pasul. She becoming pasul, meaning according to Rabbi Akiva, she has a din of a zoina. Or it's according to Rabbi Akiva, where even by an isur lav that produces a mamzer, then a woman who violated an isur lav has a din of a zoina. She can never be with a kohen, and the child that comes from it is pasul, meaning a mamzer. And v'koifen oiselohoitzi, they force the husband to send her away. Like this: whenever the isur is only an isur lav, yesh ba kedushin. It's asur, but the kedushin was affected, and therefore they have to separate because God does not allow them to be together. But they need to get v'tzricha imenu get. Being that the kedushin was taifis, she doesn't have a din of a zoina. So if, let's say, the husband dies and she's only a widow, she can marry a kohen. She's only an alamana, and she's not a zoina. V'hi ksheira, and the velad is kosher. Now the question is, what does the Braisa mean with the words velada kosher? So leman lav lekahuna, does this not mean against this opinion that velada puguma, that the velada is kosher? So the Gemara says, lohi, that's not a question. The meaning of the Braisa that a child is kosher means likahol. The child is not a mamzer, and therefore the child can marry into the Jewish community. Frek the Gemara, if the meaning of the velada kosher is she's kosher to marry the kahol, and normally we want the Mishnah to be symmetrical. So when it says that she herself is kosher, or she herself is pasul, if that's in reference to kahol, ihachi hik sheda laman, to tell you that she's kosher to marry Lakal, pshita. Of course she can marry the Kal. Means even according to Rabbi Akiva, that the woman becomes a Zoina, but she's allowed to marry another Yisrael. She just cannot marry a Kohen. So why would the Chachamim even need to say that she is kosher if we're only speaking about Heter or Isur Lakal? Mishum Dezanya, because a woman committed Zunus, should become Afsala Lakal? Elolav Likahuna. This is the third question. So when the Barais is telling you that she is kosher l'kol, meaning that she can be with a kohen, and therefore when it says her child is kosher, it means the child can be with a kohen, not paguma, not pagum. Umidahi l'kohuna v'lodanam l'kohuna, dry kashes. So now the Gemara is going to go backwards in the order, showing you how the third question is not a question, how the second question is not a question, how the refutation to the Kal V'Chomer is not a refutation, and the Kal V'Chomer is a Kal V'Chomer, and the din is a din, that the Vlad, even according to Shimon HaTimni, even though there's no Mamzerus, the Vlad will be Pog. So let's go backwards. So first of all, the Gemara says that when this Braisa says that the mother is kosher, the child is kosher, or the mother is puzzle, the child is puzzle, it doesn't have to be speaking about the same type of kashrus or psul. It can mean one can be in reference to the kol, and the other can only be in reference to kohuna. Mida iria, hake de isa v'hake de isa. One might be for one might be for the other. And I'll prove it to you. And haki nami mistabra, that they have different meanings. So it's not that symmetrical, but it must be that way, because it says in the Reisha, which is the Rabbi Kiva, the Reisha of the Braisa, that she's puzzle, and the Vlad is puzzle. Now the Gemara wants to say something. According to Rabbi Kiva, that is takeznus. He psula laman. When Rabbi Kiva says she is puzzle, who is he referring to? Not lakol. Ilema lakol mishum dezanya afsala. Lakol also not. According to Rabbi Kiva, when he said she is puzzle, since it was a chayiv lavin, according to Rabbi Kiva, chayav lavin create mamzerus. According to Rabbi Kiva, chayav lavin make the woman into a zoina. So she is puzzle a chiddush, that she can no longer marry a kohen, even if she becomes a widow, not a divorcee. Elalav lekahuna. But when Rabbi Kiva said that her child is puzzle, of course Rabbi Kiva didn't only mean that the child is puzzle lekahuna. According to Rabbi Kiva, the child is a mamzer. According to Rabbi Kiva, Vlada psula lamani lema lekuna halakol kashid. Hamar Rabbi Kiva, clearly the Vlada is a mamzer. El pshita, that Rabbi Kiva meant the Vlada is puzzle even lekol. So Rabbi Kiva, when he said the mother is disqualified and the child is disqualified, Rabbi Kiva did not mean the same disqualification. So likewise in the Seifa, by the Chachamim, it doesn't have to mean the same disqualification. So that is the third challenge. When it comes to the second challenge, when we had the words in the Torah, To'eva, he To'eva, ve'ein bonel To'avim, says the Gemara, we learned this before, I think it was in Daf Tezvav, ve'hi To'eva nami, doesn't mean the way you interpreted it, he To'eva, but ve'ein sarasa To'eva. Very important din. In other words, Reuven married, if Reuven married his divorcee, which he was not allowed to do, and he had a co-wife, and Reuven dies, so we learned that together. So the Shimon cannot do yibum with that woman who was previously divorced, like we learned, because since he's taking the place of his brother, and his brother should not have been with her, so how can Shimon rebuild his brother's house when that itself was not a good house? But when it comes to the co-wife of the Machzeh Gerushasai, so we learned in the beginning of the Masechta that whenever one wife is a erva, so what did the Mishnah tell you, Beis Hillel? Not only is she exempt, the tzara is exempt. But he To'eva was to teach you that the co-wife of a Machzeh Gerushasai is not exempt. She's not a To'eva. And with her you can even do Yibum. That's what the Hi To'eva teaches you. Avol Baneha maybe are To'avim. Hello. So the only problem we have now is that the Gemara questioned the Kal V'Chomer. That has to be answered. Like, how can you prove from an almana, which is only an isur lav, that produces a child that's a pagum? How can that be used as a source that any other chiv lav, like machzeh gerushasai, will produce a child that's a pagum? Almana produces a child that's pagum because the almana herself becomes asura l'koyin. Even if the kohen gadol dies and she's not a gerusha, she's a double almana, but she's an almana, she can no longer be with the kohen. That was the question. So el almana kasha. So we have to answer how the Kal V'Chomer will work. So what does Hakoil Moedim mean? Hakoil Moedim doesn't mean, he's not speaking about the Chachamim versus Rabbi Kiva. He's speaking here about the Rabbi Yeshua versus the Chachamim. That even according to Rabbi Yeshua, who holds that even when there is a union that's asur b'isur kares, there's no mamzerus. Mamzerus only comes when a person violates an isur for which there is a capital punishment. A lot less. Not all the 21 arroyas carry a capital punishment. Nevertheless, Rabbi Yeshua's maida, havlad will be a mamzer. That will be the din. Man hakol maidim Rabbi Yeshua. In other words, va'af lagav da'amar Rabbi Yeshua. Even though Rabbi Yeshua is the most lenient, and he holds ein mamzer even from chayav krisus. Mamzerus is only when a person violates a isur that isn't only a lav. Isn't only a lav that carries kares, but it's a lav that carries kares and misas beis din. Nevertheless, if there was no misas beis din, nehida mamzer lehava pogum miyahava, there will be a pagam. And here you have a fantastic kavuchamer from an almana without the previous refutation. Uma almana lekain gadol she'eni surah shava bakoil. Nevertheless, b'na pogum zu she'ei surah shava bakoil. A man with his daughter. Right, a man with his daughter is a capital punishment. Let's go back on normal chayav krisus. A man with his wife's sister. So zu, right, krayvas girushasai, a noidin shepana pagum. You're going to go and give me back your question. V'chitema mal almanosh keni yatzma mischalelas. So maybe here also. Maybe here when she herself is not mischalelas, so says the Gemara hachi nami, even if she violated an isur, for which there is kares, she now has a din of a zayna, even according to Rabbi Yeshua, even if the kid is not a mamzer. So the act which has an isur kares without misas beis din does make the woman herself psula l'kayin. It does make her a pagam. She is just like an almana. So we have a kavuchamer from an almana. The almana is a more restricted isur, only on a kain gadol. Nevertheless, the velad is a pagum. Anytime there is a relation that carries the penalty of kares, even according to Rabbi Yeshua that the child is not a mamzer, the child will be a pagum, meaning that if the child is a daughter, the daughter cannot marry a kain.
Can you explain the differences between pasul, pagum, chalal?
Well, the word chalal is normally a use that's used for a kain himself. That she's a kain, or he's a kain, that became a chalal. The word pagum, the word chalal cannot be used for an Israelite. The word pagum means that just like a chalal or a chalala cannot marry a kain, this Yisrael is like a chalal. Now when it comes to pagum, or what's the other word that you said? Pasul, I don't think we have the word pasul over here. Pagum means that it's psula l'kohuna, but the qualification is called a blemish. There's a blemish. Okay, so pagum and pasul means the same thing over here. Very good. So that's the end of the sugya. Again, we learned all this. Here it's the same. Clear. This is the end of the sugya. Again, with the clarification at the end that according to the conclusion, lav dafka, according to the Chachamim, a child of an Isur lav will be a pagum, lav dafka. What Shimon ben Rebbe meant was according to Rabbi Yoshua, a child from an Isur kares will be a pagum. And now the Gemara will start, at least right now, a sugya that we also had before, which is a chiddush, and it's important to know this. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yechanan. Hakoil moedim. Everyone agrees. Be'evid, if you have a non-Jewish slave or a non-Jew, Habal Bas Yisrael that had a relation with a Jewish woman, everyone is moeded that the child is a mamzer. We learned about this before. We mentioned already then that this is not the halacha, this hakol moedim. The child is considered a pagum in the context of the previous sugya. Lechatchila, such a child should not marry a kohen, but if the kohen already married her, then you don't make them get divorced. But here we're learning that the child is a mamzer. So now the Gemara says, who's the hakoil maidim? So the Gemara explains that Shimon hatimni. The afal gav the amar Shimon hatimni. Ein mamzer mechayav elavim. In other words, mamzerim are only produced when there's an isur kares. So hani mili, turning to daf memhei, mechayav elavim the tafsi b'hu kedushin. When does a forbidden union that only is prohibited by a lav not create a mamzer? If it's a prohibition which allows the marriage to go into effect. So for example, a man divorced his wife, she married another man, that second marriage was severed, so the original husband cannot marry her, there's no Kaddish, it's only don't do it. But if the husband does it, then the Kedushin is Chal, it goes into effect, and as we learned before, the Beis Din will tell them to get divorced, but he has to give her a get. So being that the Kedushin went into effect, that's why Shimon HaTimni and the Chachamim of our Mishnah hold there's no Mamzerus. But over here, even though the prohibition of a non-Jewish woman, of a Jewish woman to be with a non-Jewish man is a prohibition that does not carry the penalty of Kaddish, it's a lav without Kaddish, loises chatan bam. So you can argue, well, if that's the case, there should not be mamzerus. Kiven the loitavsi behu kedushin. Since kedushin is not taifis, Rashi brings the pasuk where we know that from. So since kedushin does not go into effect, is kechayave krisus dami. So therefore, in this sense, the child will be considered a mamzer or a mamzeres. We're going to stop over here, and Emir Hashem continue tomorrow.